Welcome everyone to Sipping Life's Tequila 101. I'm your host and certified Calador, Chris Simmons. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Tequila Basics 101. When my business partner Alan Azir and I take people through a tequila tasting, we'll oftentimes start at the beginning. What is tequila? How it's produced? Why is it gaining so much popularity? We'll talk a little bit about where tequila was just a short couple decades ago and how it's gotten to this point now. And we'll discuss our preferred method of tasting and how you should enjoy your tequila. We're here to shed some of the misconceptions of the spirit and help you fall in love with tequila just as much as we have. So what exactly is tequila? Where does it come from? Well, we know that any alcohol has a base product of sugar. If it's wine, it comes from grapes. If it's rum, it comes from molasses or sugar cane. If it's whiskey, it comes from corn, barley, wheat, or rye. If it's vodka, it comes from any of the above, basically. With tequila, we know that the base is agave. The scientific term is Agave tequilana, otherwise known as blue Weber agave. This is not a cactus, as many people assume, but rather one of many different agaves that are used to produce different spirits throughout Mexico. The blue Weber agave used for tequila production is grown mostly in the state of Jalisco, which is on the western side of Mexico. Now, there are 5 different states within Mexico that can be utilized for tequila growth, or I should say agave growth for tequila production. Most of it is centered around Jalisco, though. And then within Jalisco, we have 2 different regions. We have the highlands and the valley. Those are opposite directions from the main city of Guadalajara. These regions are very important because essentially they have 2 different styles of agave growth happening there, right? In the highlands, you have agave that is growing in really rich red soil, high in iron content. That produces a tequila that is soft. Some people will say feminine in style, fruit forward. The other direction, we have the valley. Agave growing in the valley tends to be a little more masculine, tends to have more minerality, some deeper vegetal notes. The soil in the valley is very dark and rich from the volcano. Each region bears agave with distinguishing factors. And because the soil is so different in these 2 areas, it produces a very different tequila. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's talk a little bit more about the plant. This plant is really known for its patience. It takes anywhere from 7 to 10 years for this plant to mature, and it dedicates its entire life to this one process. Once it's harvested, that's it, the plant is done. So let's move in to the actual art of tequila production. The first step of tequila production is harvesting. As we mentioned, the plant needs 7 to 10 years on average to grow. So after that plant has matured, there are men that go out into the field and harvest the plant. It's a very time-consuming and difficult job done by gentlemen named humidors. These humidors go out to the field and use a tool called a koa. They have to take each plant out by hand using this koa. Once the plants are harvested, they're going to take the piñas, or the center of the agave, back to the distillery, and that's when the process begins of making the tequila. Our first step with producing the tequila, once the agave is back in the distillery, is cooking the hearts. We need to cook these piñas to change the starch from a complex carbohydrate to simple sugar. Once the agaves have been cooked, then we need to move into the next step, which is the milling. In the milling process, we're going to take those cooked piña hearts and we're going to shred them up and extract the juice from the fibrous plant. When we talk about milling, we have 2 different processes. There's a traditional method which uses a tahona. Imagine a car wheel, but it's made out of cement or stone, and it's much larger, really big. This stone wheel sits in a circular pit and is drawn round and round by a horse. That big, heavy wheel crushes the agave and squishes the liquid out. That's a very old and traditional method, and there are only a handful of producers still utilizing this method. The other method of milling is something called a roller mill. The roller mill looks like a big machine with mechanical teeth that shred the agave apart, pulling the fibers and releasing the juice. Once we get done with milling, we're going to move into fermentation. Fermentation is a really cool step where alcohol is actually produced. Fermentation entails taking your base liquid that has the sugar, water essentially, and adding yeast. The yeast will eat the sugar and in a chemical process will create carbon dioxide and alcohol. After fermentation, we're going to move into distillation. This is the process of taking the alcohol that was produced in the fermentation process, which is around 7 or 8%, and concentrating it. Obviously, we need to get that alcohol a little bit higher. I like to tell people the process of distillation is kind of like going home and cooking some pasta. The first thing you're going to do is throw some water in a pot and put a lid on it, right? As soon as you put that lid on it, turn the heat up, eventually the water is going to start to boil. It'll turn into a steam, it'll hit the bottom part of the lid, and then turn back into water. That's essentially the process of distillation. We're taking a liquid, heating it to a boiling point, turns into steam, and then hits a cooler surface and condenses. That cooler liquid, after it's condensed, is much more alcoholic. It's condensing the alcohol, concentrating it. There are two types of distillation. There's either a pot still or a column still. Most tequila is produced using a pot still. The difference would be a pot still looks kind of like an upside down onion, if you will, right? And you put the liquid in, it boils on the bottom and goes out the top. Whereas a column still is basically a big tube. As I mentioned, most tequila is produced using the pot still. Tequila by law has to be distilled at least twice. If we're using a pot still, once it gets through the first time, it's called ordinario. They'll put that liquid back through, distill it a second time, and when it comes out at that point, it's tequila. Some producers will actually distill a third time, although it's not very common. Now that we have tequila, the final step is aging. This is a great step because this is where a lot of whiskeys are learning to love tequila. You see, most tequila producers are using barrels that were once used for bourbon. So we get these barrels down into Mexico from the United States. They've been filled with bourbon. They're now empty. We're going to wash them and reuse them. We put the tequila in there, and this is where the classifications or the levels of tequila come into play. We have 5 different categories in the world of tequila. The first category is blanco, or unaged tequila. Technically, by law, it can be aged up for 2 months, but usually it's not aged at all. This tequila is usually the most pure form and is what a lot of aficionados really love to get after because that will give them the purest essence of what the producer was trying to make. A Joven or Gold is an interesting category as some tequila aficionados dismiss the category, but most Americans understand this as a category that they grew up drinking. So a Joven or a Gold tequila is a tequila that is either a blanco and then has some kind of caramel coloring or oak extract added to it, or it's a blanco that has a reposado or an añejo added to give it some color and flavor profile. The reposado is the next category. A reposado means rested in Spanish, and essentially we're taking a blanco tequila and putting it in a barrel. By law, a reposado needs to sit in a barrel between 2 months and 1 year. The fourth category is an añejo. Añejo means old or aged in Spanish. An añejo needs to sit in a barrel between 1 year and 3 years. An extra añejo is the final category. Extra añejos sit in a barrel for any amount of time over 3 years. Now that we understand what tequila is and where it's come from, let's talk a little bit about why tequila has become so popular. Well, in order to understand why tequila has become so popular, we first need to understand 2 types of tequila. These 2 types of tequila are important for understanding because it's critical that you're drinking the right one. The first type is a mixto. Now, in order to understand what a mixto is, we have to go back to that fermentation stage and remember when the yeast is eating the sugar, creating the alcohol. That sugar is the important part here. With a mixto, only 51% of the sugar in that tequila bottle came from agave. The other 49% can come from some other cheap type of sugar, usually sugar cane. So that's going to influence the final taste and the final value or quality. The other type of tequila is 100% de agave. Now, of course, it goes without saying that 100% of the sugars in a 100% de agave come from agave. This creates a superior product, in my opinion, and is what you should be looking for when you go to buy tequila. So for quite some time, the king of the tequila world was a mixto tequila. In fact, until recently, most tequila sold in the United States was a mixto. So people would take that mixto, put it in a glass, shoot it back with salt and lime, or they'd put it in a margarita with a sugary mix, and the next day they'd complain about crazy hangovers. Well, it's understood if you drink a lesser quality product that you're going to have a lesser quality result. So our recommendation is to always drink a 100% de agave. Fortunately now times are changing as consumers are starting to pay attention to what it is they're consuming. They want to know where it comes from and how it was produced. And the producers down in Mexico are listening. They're producing much better tequila. In fact, now we're selling more 100% de agave in the United States than ever before. It's even taken over sales of mixto tequilas. Whiskey drinkers are being turned on to tequila because of the use of bourbon barrels. Bartenders are constructing delicious craft cocktails using tequila. And grocery stores are carrying 100% de agave tequilas, making it much more accessible for the public to buy quality tequila. Then the consumers are reporting back to us in the tequila industry, explaining that their experiences with tequila are leaving them feeling much better. All this comes down to better product on the market and people choosing more wisely what it is they're consuming. So here's to the continued love affair with Mexico's most beloved spirit. We hope you've fallen in love with it as much as we have. I'm your host and certified catador, Chris Simmons. We look forward to seeing you again. Salud.